Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Gilcrease Museum. I'm Allison Rossi, the Director of Learning and Community Engagement here at the museum. Today, we're honored to have with us Dr. David Penney, the Associate Director of Museum Scholarship at the National Museum of the American Indian, and one of the co-curators of Kay WalkingStick, an American artist. Prior to joining NMAI in April of 2011, Dr. Penney served as Curator of Native American Art, Chief Curator, and finally Vice President of Exhibitions and Collection Strategies at the Detroit Institute of Arts for over 30 years. His exhibitions of note include Kay WalkingStick, an American artist, with co-curator Kathleen Ash-Milby, Indigenous Beauty, American Art from the Diker Collection for the American Federation of the Arts, Before and After the Horizon, Anishinaabe Artists of the Great Lakes, a collaboration with co-curator Gerald McMaster, and the Art Gallery of Ontario in 2014. The American Indian, Art and Culture Between Myth and Reality for the Neukerk in Amsterdam, Art of the American Indian Frontier, the Chandler Port Collection for the National Gallery of Art, and the Ancient Art of the American Woodland Indians for the National Gallery of Art. The author of numerous publications, Penney's most recent work includes the exhibition catalog for Before and After the Horizon, Native American Art Pre-Contact for the acclaimed Oxford Online Bibliographies for Art History, and the widely known Native North American Art for the Thames and Hudson World of Art series published in 2004. Dr. Penney earned his PhD in Art History and Archaeology from Columbia University and his Bachelor of Arts degree in Art History from the New York University. In today's lecture, Dr. Penney will discuss how the Cherokee artist Kay WalkingStick pursued the practice of painting informed by metaphysical reflection and trace her path of constant invention, innovation, and evolving artistic and personal growth through her visually brilliant and evocative works of art. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Penney.
When I hear introductions like that, I think to myself, man, I've been busy. It's true. Anyway, welcome. It's a great privilege to speak with you, meet with you this afternoon, and I'd like to stay pretty informal. It was just a terrific opportunity to work with Kay WalkingStick on this project, and I acknowledge her daughter Erica is with us this afternoon. It's great to see her. And I think my co-curator Kathleen Ash-Milby will be joining us as well. It was just a terrific project to work on. I've known Kay since the early 1990s. And at that time, she was faculty at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, where I'd grown up. My dad was law faculty at Cornell. So I was familiar with that area, and we got to know each other, and I just got in the habit of sort of every once in a while dropping by. She was so gracious and hospitable. She had a house on Geneva Street in Ithaca where she lived and also had a studio, and I'd visit and we'd sit around her kitchen table or go into the studio and look at art and just talk about art, just endlessly. It was a great joy. I also had the opportunity, we'll see a little bit about this later on, to visit her in Italy when during one of her sojourns there. Italy, Rome in particular, became very important to her work, as you can see in the exhibition, and we'll talk about a little bit this afternoon as well. So, it's really terrific to have this exhibition touring. We've had it at the National Gallery, at the National Museum of the American Indian, of course, but it's traveled to the Heard Museum in Phoenix. It was in Dayton, Ohio, a really lovely museum in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I spent 30 years in Michigan, as you just heard. And now here, it'll go to Montclair, New Jersey, where it will close. And it just received a terrific reception everywhere. I'm particularly pleased with the installation here. It just looks fantastic. And means a great deal to us, all of us who worked on the exhibition, and I think to Kay in particular, to have her retrospective here in Oklahoma, the home of the Cherokee Nation, which she is a member. So thank you to the Gilcrease, and thank all of you for being here. Just a little bit about Kay, and I guess here's looking for my equipment. Here she is, born 1935. This is, I think, a particularly attractive picture and sort of captures, I think, something about her a character, the kind of light that sparks her personality, her intellect, and her eyes. As you can see, she was the daughter of Ralph WalkingStick. WalkingStick family here in Oklahoma, a very prominent Cherokee family, several generations involved with the Cherokee government. There's a fantastic exhibition here at the Gilcrease about Cherokee after removal. It's really wonderful to have that right across the hall from the Kay WalkingStick exhibition. Really get some sense of the roots of her family. But she didn't grow up in Oklahoma. She was the youngest child of the marriage between Ralph WalkingStick and Margaret Emma McCaig. But unfortunately, the marriage didn't endure. And Kay's mother returned to her own family shortly after Kay was born up in Syracuse, New York. And the McCaig family is probably the reason why Kay turned out to be an artist. The McCaigs are family of artists, graphic artists, painters, amateur artists, professional artists. Her grandmother once quipped, when she was a baby, she tells a story, it's kind of an awful story, but her grandmother McCaig said, well, if that child, she was born, as an infant, if she's going to grow up to be an artist, you might as well strangle her now. But she did grow up to be an artist, and it was a great, of course, pride to her family. She studied, she painted as a young person, drew and painted, studied fine arts at Beaver College, a women's college in Pennsylvania. Am I doing something about these lights, or? Oh, okay. Thank you. As you can see, Kay and her mother enjoyed a very close and warm relationship. But Kay married fairly young, Michael Eccles, her first husband, had a family, but was a housewife in that old-fashioned sense of the word in the 1950s and 1960s that many American women were expected to become. Raising children, managing a household, but Kay's horizons really expanded beyond that. She had always wanted to be an artist, a painter, and she insisted on being an artist and a painter, and being a mother, and being a wife to Michael Eccles as well. A very difficult road to hoe for anyone at any time, but as Kay liked to say, I thought I could do it, and so I did, and boy did she. Her early work, where she first began to enjoy some notoriety, she was living with her family in New Jersey, kind of the outskirts of Manhattan, a bedroom community. I think her husband Michael commuted into Manhattan for work. But she was in this circle, in the vicinity of, the great artistic developments of that moment in New York in the 60s where, the art world was kind of turning on its head. It seemed like the whole world was turning on its head. The idea of sort of personal liberation, of feminism, of alternative lifestyles. Of course, the great tragedy of the Vietnam War. You could kind of experience that a little bit with that. Of course, the PBS documentary. I guess I'm just going to have to ignore that. Anyway, I hope it's not too distracting for you. It's a little distracting for me. So in any case, she began to develop a vocabulary of painting based upon the abstraction of the time, hard edge forms, these kind of abstract nudes. They're really kind of a celebration of a renewed sexual liberation. And it's hard to kind of imagine, I think, today, where these things look rather, maybe tame in the context of 2017, but they're really quite adventuresome for the time. When she, but the fact, although these kind of paintings of nude silhouettes of nudes, men and women, kind of arranged in relaxed poses, using really vibrant color backgrounds, hard edge relationships between different colors, experimenting with the qualities of color. I'm wondering if I'm doing that with my thing. No, I guess not. she was really sort of exploring, she was joining a series of other women of that time who were like Joan Semmel, who was a faculty member at Pratt Institute, where she later went, who were, in a very kind of liberated way, exploring themes of women's, sexuality, female sexuality, which up to that time had been, kind of a forbidden topic. So it was something that she kind of wanted to explore in terms of its visual potential and the kind of ability to kind of look at the world in a fresh way. And she was getting some notoriety about it. I love the poem, which actually my colleague Kathleen Ash Milby found. WalkingStick, if you've never been in love, you won't understand her ice cream nudes. I kind of like that phrase. Edible strawberry coffee, blueberry bodies, inviting you to taste. Oh boy. So anyway, it really inspired a lot of interest and notoriety, but it really was not, she finally decided in the end, or at least, kind of played that out as far as she could, but wanted to explore new horizons. She went to got a very prestigious scholarship to the Pratt Institute, a very prestigious art school in New York City, while still raising a family. And she had always been in the habit of going around New York City and looking at different artists and being very up to date with the artists that were showing at that time. Really wanted to be part of that art world. One exhibition, one artist that really kind of captured her imagination. She saw an exhibition by the African-American artist Sam Gilliam, who had a very interesting show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1971. Here's a photograph of the original installation. And here's the same piece, or related piece, on the wall on the left, currently on display over the National Gallery of Art. And what he was doing that kind of intrigued her was this idea of using these stained canvases, raw stained canvases. Instead of stretching them in a frame, he was allowing them to hang and drape to make these very evocative curves and kind of swags of cloth. And that kind of inspired her to think about different kinds of abstract forms that she might be able to work with in this, adopting a more kind of rigorous kind of abstraction, deciding to reject the idea of figural painting of actual people and things, and really explore the potential for abstraction to convey human ideas and humanistic notions. Her first experiments with this are a series of paintings where she kind of investigated the relationship between her domestic work as a mother and her artistic work, and the common point between them was her working apron, the apron you wear when you cook, the apron she would wear when she painted to keep her, which also could become covered with paint. There are a whole series of these apron paintings dating from the early 70s, and you notice that the apron form is kind of suspended on a grid of a background, very faint lines. And I always like to think about this as a kind of a precursor to some of the metaphysical and kind of philosophical ideas, in that this hanging drapery on a grid is kind of a meditation between the conceptual power of geometry. I mean, geometry is something that we carry in our minds to kind of organize the world into straight lines and corners and so on, versus the inevitable qualities of earthbound gravity, so that and how the two kind of work together. And she was particularly interested in the relationship between that kind of conceptual straight line and the kind of less predictable line of how drapery or fabric will fall and create a kind of a curve or an arc, she called it. And you notice the kind of arcs that she's painted against that grid in the kind of shoulders of the apron or the way the apron hangs. She further explored this idea of the curves created by suspended drapery in a series of cathartic works where she began to reflect upon her relationship with her largely absent Cherokee father. She first constructed a kind of a fabric teepee in her backyard as a kind of inspiration point, but followed that quickly with a series of paintings like the one you see on the right. It's in the exhibition, called Teepee Form, where she takes that kind of idea of a conical structure supported by, again, just geometrical conception of the teepee poles creating that cone, but then the flow and the curves of the drapery suspended against it. You can see how she's in this very beautifully painted canvas sort of suggests that cone shape of a teepee, but also that tension between kind of suspended fabric, the straight lines of the grid, and the curved lines, curved edges of that representation of a curved fabric. She was exploring this in her work on her MFA at the Pratt Institute, and then came up with a series of paintings that I think have really enduring value and interest. She named many of them after prominent Cherokee or American Indian figures, but also enjoyed other titles as well. But this is kind of what she was thinking about. This on the right-hand side is the painting in the exhibition. It's entitled For John Ridge. It was painted in 1975. When I move, do I do something? It's okay. Anyway, she started with, like Sam Gilliam, with a kind of raw, stained canvas using ink, actually red ink and other colors. And by stained, you mean you don't actually sort of paint lines on it, but you kind of move pigment, very kind of thin, translucent pigment across, and really enjoy the different qualities of how the pigment settles into the fabric itself, kind of creating, as you can, a variety of different kinds of shades and hues. But she stretched that on a canvas and then covered portions of it with a thick black opaque pigment, leaving the stained canvas in reserve. On the painting on the right for John Ridge, you can see this fairly clearly with that frame of the rectangle is the raw stained canvas. The black is the opaque paint. And then if you notice, and it's kind of hard to see a little bit, but there is suspended sort of within that rectangle is this form that can be read almost like a piece of cloth or a fabric or a hide that's tacked to the inside corners and then is left suspended in the middle, leaving these large arc forms, kind of two short ones for the short side, as you can see here and down here, so these are the arc forms that are left in reserve. She began then to kind of break out these arcs formed by the long and short edges of the canvas and kind of rearrange them in different patterns. So here on the left-hand side, I think is a really very important painting of this series. And she thought it was very important too, actually. She dedicated it, she gave it to the Newark Art Museum where it's currently on display. And in memory of her recently deceased mother, Emma McKay. So it really meant a lot to her. And she called it, she gave it a very kind of sort of rich title, meaningful title, Lifeless, Deathless, Endless, Ad Reinhardt of 1976. Ad Reinhardt was really a very prominent abstract painter of that time, maybe certainly older than she was, but really a kind of a figure she looked up to. And he had this kind of formula for abstract painting where he wanted to kind of take stuff out and reduce things to the essence of painting. You know, no figures, not objective, not representational, but just the painting itself. So her evocation of Ad Reinhardt, I think, is something about her ambition to approach painting in that way. But she takes the four arcs of the short sides and long sides and kind of arranges them here in this more heraldic form. You can see a lot more of the unstained canvas underneath. These stained canvases with green and red and a variety of other colors and this kind of rich combination of palettes and almost kind of unpredictable shifts from one color to another. She unifies the four arcs, the long ones and the short ones, with a little charcoal line that goes to the center. And it creates this kind of celebratory, almost heraldic kind of form where the shapes are kind of the arcs are kind of contained within this black opaque grid, but then the stained canvas can really, you can see it kind of shines forth in a really very beautiful way. And in these paintings, she's really exploring the potential to deal with big humanistic issues, the issues that she's facing with the grief over her deceased mother, the ideas, the great ambitions of being a painter. How can you kind of approach these large humanistic themes that artists have struggled with for centuries using this very minimalist language of abstraction? So this is what she was doing when she was in school. Really the most ambitious series from this work from this kind of episode when she was at Pratt are a series of 33 small canvases This is they're here arranged in a kind of a grid in the way that we're displaying them in the gallery. And here is one that's been pulled out for detail. Of course, it's, I gotta imagine this thing over here, by the magic of PowerPoint, is blown up, but it's actually the same size as one of these. And you can see these in the gallery. And you can see the same kind of geometric progression through different combinations of long arcs, again, drawn from that same process of defining the, that fabric draped within a rectangle. Long arcs, short arcs, and really working now with the qualities of this opaque over surface, which now she's working in a number of different colors: black, opaque black, blues, reds, silvers, other kinds of colors, all in series and all in variations. She named this this painting the Chief Joseph series, and it was based upon a conversation that she had, kind of a rare conversation that she had with her father, Ralph WalkingStick. And she asked him, if you were to look back at the sort of this long and kind of difficult history between American Indians and the United States, who are some of the figures that you admire? Who are some of the American Indian figures that you really feel we should think more about and respect? And he mentioned Chief Joseph. Chief Joseph, of course, was the Nez Perce chief who the U.S. government asked to or forced to give up their land in the Northwest in Idaho, and rather than be confined upon a poor reservation, he led his people. This is just right after the Battle of the Sioux fights with the U.S. government in the 1870s, but he decided to take his people to liberation in Canada. But after being pursued by the cavalry for quite a bit of time, ultimately was unsuccessful. You may recall his quote, it's often repeated, "I will fight no more forever." But here was a man who had a great deal of integrity, a great deal of courage, and a great deal of commitment to the future of his people. Hence, Ralph WalkingStick's admiration for him. And so Kay dedicated and titled this series after him. And again, with these titles, like for John Ridge, the painting we just saw a moment ago, who was the controversial leader of the Cherokee, of the Treaty Party. Actually, her mother, Kay, reports that when she grew up, she had a McKinney & Hall portrait of John Ridge in her home. Or Chief Joseph, a figure admired by her father. She also did a painting in the series she called Sacagawea, Leader of Women. She, of course, Sacagawea was the female guide for the Lewis, underrated, underappreciated female guide for the Lewis and Clark expedition of 1802. She was seeing that this language of abstraction, or working with this language of abstraction to deal with these big heroic themes and issues. What I particularly like about these is that they're all individual and handmade. They look kind of minimalist, kind of simple, but they're actually a result of a very laborious process. The same staining of the underlying canvas, stretching it on a frame, and then applying this thick pigment on top, which she applied with her hands, leaving these forms in relief. So actually, she's not painting the arcs. The arcs are kind of defined by the thick pigment all around them. So they're handmade. It took her actually about 2 years to make all of these. There's a kind of a ritual quality to them, a kind of repetitive quality. And they themselves kind of, with their variations of these patterns of short and long arcs, kind of also emulate the idea of repetitive ritual, of really kind of prayer in one way or another. So we acquired this series for the National Museum of the American Indian. We see this as really one of the high points of this episode of her career, and one of the great masterpieces that we love to feature in this exhibition. She worked with abstraction and with this thick pigment. What she would do is actually add acrylic paint to a saponified wax, which is kind of a cold wax. But that makes a very thick pigment where you can build it up on the surface. It creates a very heavy relief. Look closely at the surfaces of some of those early paintings and you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. And then she could manipulate it with her hands in this kind of, instead of using a brush, this also sort of emulates a kind of almost ritualistic process of adding pigment to canvas. And she used that technique and that saponified wax pigment to create a series of very large paintings, abstract paintings, always in this square. And then in the late 1980s, she began to experiment with coupling, these kinds of paintings, which are, again, variations on this arc form with this very left in reserve, with this very thick saponified wax pigment with a number of colors kind of mixed in, and then combining them with paintings of landscape, also done with her hand, a very sort of painted with her hands in a kind of almost impressionistic way, to give you a sort of a sense of topography, of water, of motion. This painting is entitled The Abyss of 1989. I think it's a very important painting, but a very painful painting in some ways. She had just achieved some success. She'd been teaching art in the New York City area, but landed a very prestigious job on the faculty of Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. The water forms that we see here are actually based upon gorges. Cornell University is perched on the side of the hill up above Hugo Lake, and it's bordered by two large streams that have cut deep gorges. We'll see a photograph of these in a moment, on either side of the campus. So the subject of these landscapes are going down into the gorges, one in Fall Creek, and doing these kind of close investigations of the water and rocks there. This painting and a series of these paintings were inspired by, or sort of prompted, in a way, or almost a result of a very an awful incident where her husband, Michael Eccles, died quite suddenly, just shortly after she moved to Ithaca. And she was in the advanced stages of grief and mourning. As an artist, one of the only ways she could think of kind of working through this really awful moment in her life, the loss of her life companion, was to paint, and to paint more fiercely. And she saw in these kind of very dramatic landforms. Here's actually I'm standing up on a suspension bridge here, looking down at the gorge, where she stood right here where I've got this arrow. Here's a photograph of my standing in the same spot in Ithaca, New York, which is the basis of The Abyss, the painting that you see up here above. Here's a preparatory charcoal drawing of some of this from the same vantage point, and you can see the kind of angled form of the rocks and how the landscape is paired up with an equally sized abstract painting. She saw the abstraction as a way of approaching kind of the notion of the spirit, of immortality, of kind of the way that life and presence kind of endures beyond physical form, whereas the landscape, this rushing water, as it becomes a kind of metaphor, an allegory for the rushing, transitory nature of human life. Everything is impermanent. Everything kind of rushes by. And she saw that the two together really kind of helped kind of define what our situation is as human beings on this earth, with these aspirations for, kind of a spiritual life, a spiritual reality beyond our physical limitations, but the inevitability of impermanence, the inevitability of our materiality degrading away, as symbolized by rushing waters, eroding rocks, and this kind of dangerous spot, the perilousness and the impermanence of life in the midst of all this. This is really very, not an unfamiliar idea in landscape painting, where landscape becomes a kind of a means of investigating the idea of deity, the idea of deity in nature, the spirituality of nature. This is when we were familiar with this really from here's the idea of romanticism, of romantic kind of painting. This is a charcoal drawing from a different waterfall location, Freeman State Park, just outside of Ithaca and Devil's Falls. And again, we're this kind of matching up of physical landscape on one side with these rushing waters, this idea of impermanence and the transitory nature of life, is matched up here with this very ethereal kind of spiritual presence, kind of floating with echoes, kind of with indeterminate borders within this black field in the abstraction. The title, Is That You, is actually a reference to this feeling that she had for several months after the death of Michael, that he was still there somewhere. He was kind of lingering somewhere in her consciousness. And that question kept occurring to her, and kind of a feeling or a sensation. Is that you? Or where are you? All of us who have lost a loved one, I think, have experienced that kind of feeling. And that's the way that she uses painting to communicate to us and to connect to our deepest feelings. This is really one of the great joys and tragedies of being a human being, is having that love and attachment to other human beings, and of course the frailty and the grief that follows inevitable loss. So using abstraction, using allegorical landscape, she's investigating these big humanistic issues which all of us can identify with. Here are some of the locations. That was a suspension bridge I was standing on above Fall Creek. And then the location is just above this cataract. Here is Devil's Falls and Lucifer Falls in Tremont State Park. And you can see the landscapes that she painted were very much based upon these particular forms, where she would go up, do studies, do preparatory drawings, and then work them up into large charcoal drawings, often using also oil stick to create large-scale drawings, and then these the final paintings with the saponified wax, those diptychs with the abstract and the landscape side. She was reading when she was at Pratt Institute as a student. Part of the inspiration of all this, the work of an art historian named Robert Rosenblum, who wrote a book called the Abstraction and the Northern Romantic Tradition. Robert Rosenblum was really interested in the fact that out of the kind of Northern Romantic painting, you think of American landscape painting, European painters like David Friedrich and others, paintings like this of the Romantic era in Europe, that artists were exploring these kinds of themes of sort of romanticism, the idea of deity that resides in nature, something that's quite familiar to us. And actually, her reading of Robert Rosenblum's book, which was kind of interesting, another point kind of incidentally of connection between us, I studied with Robert Rosenblum when I was at NYU, and so when we kind of came upon this in our conversations around the kitchen table, so, well, you read that too? I said, yes, it was just kind of this wonderful sort of meeting point, but the book was profoundly influential in her thinking about the potential for landscape to convey these kinds of human feelings. These are two illustrations of sort of romantic paintings that Robert Rosenblum was discussing when he was talking about this idea of romance, of romantic painting, romantic landscapes, landscapes as allegories for human feeling and human experience. She got fairly well known. She was fairly well known for those diptychs, and that's really where a whole series of them were shown at various venues, and that's about the time that I got to know her as well. I would say that the greater art world got more acquainted with her work as well. Those diptychs from Ithaca, the Ithaca Falls series, and were featured in a very important exhibition in New York called the Decade Show in 1990. They were featured and discussed by major art historians for a major Canadian exhibition of 1991, Land, Spirit, Power. She was, exhibition of her drawings was reviewed by the major New York Times critic who is still writing today and a great fan of her work, Holland Carter. Gallery produced a small catalog, and he wrote the catalog essay for it. So the diptychs and her formula, this method of working for you combining an abstraction on one hand and the landscape on the other to kind of deal with the two sides of kind of the human condition, the spiritual and the material, we're proving quite successful for it in a very fertile area for her to develop. She did other series based upon other locations. She went out to Sun Crater, Arizona, about extinct volcanic crater in Arizona. There's a series of paintings in the exhibition. They're based upon that site, remnants of the cataclysm and others. But she kind of played out that vein of painting for several years in the early 1990s, but felt that there were other bridges to cross, other horizons to look at. And one of her inspirations was the opportunity as a faculty member of Cornell University to travel to Italy with students and do residences in Rome, where she would teach on one hand, but also be able to paint on the other. It was interesting that in Italy, and the series of paintings that she did there, first of all, she began to understand that her interest in landscape really went further than just the landscape itself, but she was understanding that land was kind of a metaphor for the material human condition, in other words, our bodies. So just as the earth, Mother Earth has form, our bodies have form, the landscape becomes for her a kind of way of investigating the materiality of her own body, an identification between herself and the earth. And in that work, the figure comes back. She's remembering those earlier paintings that she did with the figures in silhouette, and begins to introduce them not in these kind of semi-erotic poses that she had, or these languorous poses of the earlier paintings, but poses that kind of emulate the idea or suggest the notion of meditation or a spiritual reflection. This pose here of a figure in faint outline against a very different kind of color palette for this landscape in Italy, with that kind of Mediterranean light inspiring for her, instead of those blues and dark reds of the North American paintings, these yellows and greens that kind of reflect Mediterranean light. She always thought that painting was really a part of spiritual investigation of our spiritual selves. She converted to Catholicism around this time. She was very drawn to the traditions and to the kind of rituals of Catholicism, and was intensely investigating Italian painting as expressions of Catholic spirituality. She had experimented with incorporating different materials. Remember that we were just talking about this saponified wax. She began to introduce leaf gold and other metals. So in this painting, you can see that there's gold in the background for the sky. These were inspired by Italian gold-ground paintings. Paintings of Duccio and other Trecento artists who would use gold to surround images of the Madonna or the Christ on the cross in order to kind of suggest this notion of spiritual purity. In Italy, on one hand, there's this kind of reinvestigation and the typical sort of fashion for Kay, and that the spiritual is always accompanied by the material. There is a kind of renewed liberation of her own feelings of her own independence and sexuality, but also this deep spiritual, inward-looking search for spiritual truths through religion and through the expression of meditation, and looking for symbols in her paintings to kind of express those kinds of explorations, using gold-ground paintings of the Italian Renaissance as a point of inspiration. Really taken a very interesting turn and very different kind of look when you think back to the Chief Joseph series, how her painting continues to kind of progress and change, but always bound by this idea of an ambition where where painting has the opportunity to kind of address this duality between our materiality on one hand and our spirituality on the other, hence the kind of diptych format. When she did a lot of work in Italy, she took classes there. She was resident at the Academy of Rome, and there's a whole series of paintings in the exhibition that stem from that Italian episode. But she's basically a North American. She's also very much became a part of a community of American Indian artists, Native artists of her generation, younger artists. By 2000, the early 2000s or so, she was really beginning to see, people began to see her, our fellow artists, her colleagues began to see her as a kind of matriarch of Native painters, contemporary Native painters in this country. She was being recognized. She was seen as a leader. She was seen as one of the most prominent and most visible painters of this very tight-knit community of Native artists working in North America, both in Canada and the United States. And she saw that, really the most fertile ground for her continued development was the land, the ground of North America itself, the homeland of the original homeland of Native people, and her own patrilineal people, the Cherokee. So one of the things that kind of interested her as landscape painting was that the way that 19th century landscape painters of the United States kind of used painting as a way of kind of claiming a national identity for this United States, this United States Republic. That the land itself became a kind of patriotic symbol for the Republic of America. So, of course, here at the Gilcrease, you're incredibly rich in this tradition of American landscape painting, where largely male white painters going out into the West were creating these large, grand visions of this unique character of North America. But from a Native perspective, they're a little odd in the sense that they're empty, there are no people there. And they are kind of a statement about these great empty riches of land and land form that America was destined to develop, to fill, and to extract wealth and prosperity from. And of course, as symbols of the potential for the expansion of a patriotic America, these were very effective in conveying that message, like this Thomas Moran painting of Zion Valley made in 1916. From a Native perspective, these were kind of claims upon a land that was not a wilderness, that was inhabited by Native people and had been inhabited for thousands and thousands of years, but been sort of emptied out by rhetoric, by political oppression, by removal, and then with these false claims of an empty wilderness being kind of transformed into this modern, bustling, urban America without Indians in it. So she saw this as a kind of a project as a landscape painter to kind of reclaim and to reinvestigate. How can we reimagine the great physical wonders, the material wonders of American landscape, while avoiding these kinds of patronizing, male-dominated, this sort of male gaze of land that's ripe for conquest, land that's it's kind of this funny, it's pure on one hand, but which is it's an admirable quality. It's feminized in that way, but ripe for conquest on the other. She wanted to kind of turn that around. Yes, it's pure, it's feminized, identified with her own body and the bodies of countless Native inhabitants who've been living in North America for generations and generations, but how to kind of convey that while kind of wrestling with the tradition of landscape painting. So actually, as a result of these kinds of investigations and interests, she began to investigate this a project of visiting important physical sites, landscape sites across North America. She traveled widely into the Southwest, New Mexico and Arizona, up to Utah, Idaho, Montana, and began to make sketches and drawings of prominent places there. She was following up on the Chief Joseph theme that had been suggested to her by her father. She went up and to look at the traditional homelands of Chief Joseph's people, the Nez Perce, and began to make paintings based upon that. But how to kind of indigenize them, how to kind of convert them from that kind of agenda of conquest and claim by the settler populations and kind of make them more from an indigenous point of view. And then also kind of benefit from her interest in this. One thing that occurred to her was that there is this traditions of North American art, the indigenous traditions of North American Indian art, often use geometric abstraction as well. So she began to explore themes or motifs that were drawn from American Indian art. In this case, this painting, Walla Walla Mountains, which is the traditional homeland of the Nez Perce, she combines a charcoal drawing of the mountains themselves with geometric patterns that are drawn from parfleche, or these are rawhide envelopes made by native women of the plains as containers. They're kind of folded so you can keep things inside, meat, dried meat, and other kinds of things. And the exteriors are painted with these kind of colorful geometric designs. Yellow, blue, red, and these combinations of triangles and rectangles. And here she uses the indigenous Nez Perce parfleche design to frame the landscape as a way of conveying how its ownership, its possession, its indigenous origins as indigenous place, as indigenous terrain, kind of reclaiming that landscape from the traditions of American landscape painting and making it something more from a native perspective. This, as you can see in the exhibition, proved to be another extremely fruitful vein for her investigation to mine for further paintings. She often maintains this diptych format, this way of kind of looking at things from two different directions, these kind of binaries that kind of help kind of create what I like to refer to in my essay in the catalog, a kind of stereo view. The ways of kind of looking at two things, when sometimes when you take two different perspectives, their three-dimensionality kind of pops into view. So she often will continue to use that diptych format, the two paintings side by side. She did this painting, which is now at the Denver Art Museum, to address the Cherokee removal in particular, Farewell to the Smokies. She had not traveled to the Smokies as a young person. Did so just shortly before she made this painting, was inspired by their beauty, and then, but also inspired about imagining the kind of pain of having to abandon that country, being forced to leave and to live somewhere else, and how difficult that must have been for her walking stick ancestors. I remember her telling me that she had once promised herself earlier in her career never to do a painting about removal, but in the end she just could not resist. It was such a powerful theme for her. So you can see these beautiful landforms of the Smoky Mountains drawn upon that now years and years of investigating the techniques and landscape painting, but then the shadows of the Cherokee who are walking from left to right, abandoning, being forced to leave the Smokies, being forced to leave their homeland to travel here to Oklahoma. And in other sites she would visit, she would often investigate, do a little bit of research. She's often come to the National Museum of the American Indian and go into our storage, planning to do a painting about Montana, or planning to do a painting about Arizona, or maybe the Grand Canyon. She wanted to know, well, who were the people who lived there originally? What did their art look like? What kinds of things did they make? How can I create a sign for their presence and continued presence and connection to that land? So here in this painting of St. Mary's Mountain in Montana, she uses an excerpt from Cheyenne beadwork in this little kind of strip of geometric design that's kind of imposed between us as the viewer on the surface of the painting with the landscape behind us as a kind of a filter or a lens for us to view the landscape behind. Again, conveying this idea of indigenous presence, kind of an indigenous frame, an indigenous way of seeing the land. And then reclaiming that tradition of landscape painting for herself. So I've just shown you really a small sample of the great wonders that you have here at the Gilcrease now with this exhibition. It was just a project of great joy for Kathleen Nash-Bilby and I to work on the project, to assemble this exhibition, to share it with all of you. It was incredibly exciting to work with Kay and to work with this marvelous body of accomplishment by this great American painter, Kay WalkingStick. So I invite you to spend some time in the gallery, think about some of the themes I talked about, the power of abstraction, the allegorical nature of landscape, how to convert this tradition of landscape to a more indigenous lens, and see what you can find in those paintings as well. They're really endlessly fascinating. I find myself looking at them over and over and over again. Never get boring to me. That's the extent of my prepared remarks. I think we may have time for some questions, if you've got some. Anybody got a question, or should we just go to the please, Erica.
Is the exhibition here, does it contain all of the paintings that were originally at the Smithsonian?
You know, I haven't done a one-to-one count. I think there are most of them, maybe not all of them. As the exhibition has traveled from one venue to another, of course, we have galleries of different sizes. And so the curators who have hosted this exhibition have done a wonderful job kind of adapting the exhibition to those individual spaces. Some were reduced considerably in some locations. Here, I think we're seeing most of them, but it's what I really admire about the installation here is that they really, as we attempted with the exhibition organization, we wanted to take our visitors through a journey of her work, kind of through a lifetime. And I think the Gilcrease has been very successful in the installation here in that way.
I noticed that she painted on wood occasionally. Did she have a favorite type of wood?
I don't know the answer to that question. I do know, however, that she was quite omnivorous with regard to media, meaning that she tried lots of different kinds of media, lots of different kinds of wood, sometimes masonite, or sort of pressed wood. I don't think she was dedicated or, interested in a particular kind of wood. Some of the use of wood as a background also, or as a support, stems from the Italian episodes where she was seeing wood supports in Italian paintings. There was an episode in her life just after, she was going back and forth from Italy, where she was battling an illness, which she covered completely, but she couldn't work in a large scale. So she was doing more tabletop paintings. There are some smaller paintings, Duccio's Devil, for example, where it's on wood and sort of based upon the painting at the Frick. And she was in New York City at that time, living in Jackson Heights, so that was an inspiration to her. So she was doing these kinds of projects at that time that kind of stemming from that Italian episode and her circumstances. But then now she's working on these big canvases. The earlier ones, those big saponified wax diptychs, are quite heavy. And so she likes to joke that they're only as big as she could lift at that time. And she was a pretty strong woman, she could heft them around. But I don't think she was dedicated to any particular kind of wood, but there are circumstances where she chose wood for very particular reasons.
Thank you.
Question?
I noticed that a lot of the paintings in the exhibition are a collection of the artist.
Yes.
So what kind of storage facility, or, because it seems like a lot of work, that's in the collection of the artist, so where does she store it?
Now we're getting into the kind of the wonky, back of the house kind of part of the story. She was, when she was faculty at Cornell, she'd use a storage facility in Elmira. And early in our sort of work on the exhibition, we made trips up to that storage facility. It was a large kind of art warehouse run by people who stored art for a living. So it was a very secure museum-like facility in terms of museum storage, but not kind of open to the public. So they're well cared for. Since then, I think most of the paintings have come out of Elmira. She's now got a larger home, and most of the paintings are stored there. Yes, there's a lot of, she still owns a great deal of work. We're hopeful that this exhibition will help those works find their way into more prominent art museums. But also you'll notice that we have loans from the Metropolitan Museum, from the Denver Art Museum, from the Heard. So she is represented in many of the major museums in the United States. And we hope many more. Question?
Just a comment, I guess. It looked to me like she was an American Indian artist, and there's 70s when she made these combination pictures in the last few issues. And she was in her 30s. She was a woman artist interested in sexuality and womanhood and so on. Could you say some more about that?
Well, all of us as human beings are many, many different things. I think she is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, but she's always referred to herself as a mixed race person. So all of our lives are very complex. She's also a woman in a largely male-dominated field. So those issues of identity have interested her, and sometimes one comes out more than another. But I think her interest in kind of exploring her Cherokee identity also comes out in the abstract paintings, mostly through her use of titles. But she wasn't alone. Sam Gilliam, for example, the African-American artist, was also kind of committed to abstraction. And working about the same time, he was probably one of the most prominent African-American artists working in the 70s. But many of his colleagues and critics said, well, what's African-American about your paintings? They just look like abstract paintings. And his point was, he had a very eloquent statement about this, that really painting is about all humanity. I'm coming to this as an African-American person, but I think that the vehicle of abstraction can address these larger humanistic issues in which being an African-American is a part. So he used, for example, abstraction to create a series of paintings that were dedicated to, were titled, I think it's August 4th, which is the date of Martin Luther King's assassination. And then the criticism around that, or at least the critique, but nobody was saying he was doing a bad job, but kind of the questions that came up, well, how does these abstract paintings, I don't see a narrative there. And he had this sort of statement about this ability of abstraction. And I think that Kay's early work really joined that same project. That abstraction wasn't simply about form, it was about how to express big humanistic themes. Erica.
I actually have another answer that asked to that.
Sure.
The death of her father in the 1972, 3, 4, around there, caused her to reinvestigate her identity, really. Up until then, she had been playing the role of a housewife. And so those news were for her an effort to break out into a broader identity as a free woman. And when her father died, she really, the grief that it inspired caused her to dig much deeper into herself, to recognize parts of herself that I think maybe she had been denying somewhat. And the teepee piece and the apron pieces were sort of a bridge to a broader investigation of her Indian identity.
Yeah, thank you, Erica. Those who weren't able to hear, what Erica's talking about is that the fact that the death of her father really was a kind of a watershed moment where that prompted her to kind of dig deeper and to really investigate her Cherokee ancestry in a more sustained way. Question in the back.
Yes, did she travel or come to Oklahoma very much when she was growing up? And then also, how she refers so much in the book about Cherokee, but when did she become enrolled in the Cherokee Nation, as a young girl or as an adult?
And I'm not certain about that. She was the youngest of her Cherokee siblings, and she also so she had a family, or parts of her family were here in Cherokee in Oklahoma, and I didn't have detailed conversations with her about traveling back and forth, but I met some of her walking sticks at her more recent marriage to her second husband, Dirk Bach. And they were telling stories about, picking her up at the airport when she was a teenager, and how her older brother, who was down here in Oklahoma, was such a handsome guy. He showed up with his pompadour hair and a fancy car, and she just was in love with him, thought he was the greatest guy. So she stayed in touch with the family as much as possible. But she was in Syracuse most of the part growing up there, and that her father's family were down here in Oklahoma. Her mother, McKay, I think, made a tremendous effort to make sure that she knew who her father was and who her family in Oklahoma and was very supportive of her. So that even as a 11-year-old, she very consciously, I think it was 11 or sort of young, she changed the spelling of her name to correspond more to the Cherokee spelling, Oklahoma spelling with a capital S instead of a small s, which of course vexed all of her junior high school teachers. Why would you do that? But it was a difficult issue to navigate with families, separated families so far away, and I think she did the best she could. The questions? Way in the back.
I've got one. This either Dave, this is for you, or perhaps for Erica. I'm wondering, the cave painting that is in the Gilcrease collection is for John Ridge.
Yeah.
Do you know if is the WalkingStick family related to John Ridge?
I think the WalkingStick family was part of the sort of the treaty. The group of Cherokee were part of the treaty nation, it's my colleague Kathleen Ash Milby really did most of the work in terms of the family history, and I don't have it at the top of mind. I know that when I discussed that painting with her, it was inspired by the fact that her mother, probably from her WalkingStick connection, had this portrait, famous McKinney Hall portrait of John Ridge hanging in the household all the time she was growing up. So at that time, after her father's death, when she's beginning to kind of investigate all this in a more sustained way, she's looking for those touchstones. The conversation with her father about Chief Joseph, the portrait that was hanging in her home, other prominent Native women in American history, like Sacagawea and so on. So those were the ways she was trying to get back in touch with that history that she'd been separated from as a child.
She never mentioned to me that we were related to John Ridge, but I think she probably would have said so.
Yeah, no, that's something that a few of our visitors have asked over the title of that painting.
So Eric, what was that? What did you
Yeah,
say?
she never mentioned to me any relation to John Ridge.
Yeah. No, the connection she mentioned to me was the portrait hanging in the hall. And I think if I recall correctly from Kathleen's investigation of her ancestry, that the WalkingSticks were part of that, that treaty party. And actually the history of those different, the John Ridge, the John Ross, the old settlers, dealt with really in a wonderful way, very informative way, really important episodes of American history in the exhibition. I'm sure that the late Dwayne King helped organize for the Gilcrease. And so it's a great privilege. It's really wonderful to have those two exhibitions side by side here. We're very grateful to the Gilcrease for doing that. Well, we've had a wonderful time. Thank you so much.